At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
How many of you have had the experience like I have of driving down the road and all of a sudden realizing that I have no clue what I've passed by for the last 5 to 10 minutes? It is so interesting that sometimes we just lose all sense of total consciousness and awareness. And today I'm really excited to be able to interview a gentleman who has written an amazing book called Your Conscience: The Key to Unlock Limitless Wisdom and Creativity and Solve All of Life's Challenges, by Leonard Perlmutter. And I'm really excited to have Leonard on the show with us today. He's going to talk about his concept of consciousness and how there are literally 4 functions of the mind that can affect the way that we experience the outcomes in our lives, and how we can literally make the choice to change those outcomes if we're not happy with them, and choose to make those outcomes one of happiness and excitement and love and joy and all of those types of things. So I hope you'll join us, and welcome Leonard as we go through the show today. Thanks so much. Leonard, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, Doug. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I really appreciate you being on the show. It's as I've done a little bit of research on your website and your book and so forth. You actually have a couple of books. The latest one that you've written, called Your Conscious. I'm fascinated by all of that. But what I'm most fascinated about is who you are and what you have actually accomplished, because you're kind of, in my mind, in my experience, a little bit out there in left field. A tad. Okay.
I thought I was in right field, but
Well, it all depends. But as I'm looking at your bio, it's like, my goodness, you're working with this medical group and that medical group, and even to the point of, what is it, military academy at West Point.
yeah,
So
that was a great
I would
experience.
love for you to share with the audience who you are, how you got into what you're doing now, and then we'll have a lot of fun talking about it all.
Sure. Well, when I was a kid, for some reason, I was always very philosophically oriented. It's just the way that I saw the world. And not only was I philosophical, but I had an emphasis toward practicality. I always had a bit of an allergic reaction to esoterica, just for esoterica's sake. But if it had a practical application in my life, I would work with it. I would experiment with it. So when I was probably maybe around 10, I joined the Cub Scouts. And then after that, I enjoyed it so much, I joined the Boy Scouts. And I loved scouting because it was so practically oriented. It taught you life skills that could actually be used for your benefit whenever was needed. And in fact, I'm thinking the motto in Scouts was "Be prepared." And I was a curious fellow, and so I asked the Scoutmaster once, our motto was "Be prepared." Be prepared for what? And he looked at me in a strange way, and he said, "How would I know?" And that's the key. How do we know? This is a difficult assignment we've taken, being a human being, and we need some tools. We need some skill sets to be able to deal with the unexpected. I mean, who among us would have ever figured that a major pandemic would reach throughout the world and cause everything to be upside down and inside out? You just don't know. But if you have tools to be flexible enough, that would help. So that's the way I saw the world. And when I was 25, I was publishing a newspaper. It was a community newspaper, but during the early 70s, it was a little radical. Uh, and I went to Sears, big department store at the time, and was looking for advertising. When I got there, nobody was in reception. And so I walked down a long corridor where I could see that there were other offices, and nobody was there. I would poke my head in one office, no one there. In another office, no one there. And I got to the end of the corridor, and there, at the end of the corridor, in front of an artist's easel, up against the wall, was a woman. And I said to her, "Is there nobody here?" And she looked at me in amazement and said, "I'm here." Now, I like that answer. I like it very much.
Yeah.
This woman can hold her own. That's great. And so I said, "Well, do you have a philosophy of life?" And don't you know, this is the human being that I had been looking for 25 years. We started a conversation that afternoon, and we have continued it all these years. We married in 77, and we've been on this journey together. And we've been looking for the truth. We've been looking for practical ways to get along in life and to prosper in life and to be secure and be happy. And that led me ultimately to the perennial philosophy that revealed this ancient science that predates human history. It's the oldest continuous philosophy on the planet, the origin of every religion, and yet it's not a religion, it's an educational body of knowledge. And one of the cornerstones of this yoga science is understanding the mind and knowing how to coordinate the mind in service to the wisdom of the conscience.
All right. So you use the word yoga. Now, to me, that gives me a picture, especially on Facebook, where, everybody's doing their yoga poses and doing all of that kind of stuff. And every once in a while I've thought, I'd love to do some yoga, but my knees can't handle it. My shoulders can't handle it. And so what are you talking about when you say yoga?
Well, yoga, the science of yoga, is much broader than just the physical exercises, the physical postures. Although it does contain physical postures, namely because we have a body. We have to exercise the body in some fashion. So, but it's much broader. And even the physical postures are really about the mind and focusing the mind and creating a flexible mind so that the body can become flexible. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as you've been working with all of these medical centers, what is it that you're doing, and what is the outcome that you're providing as you come into these? What I'm looking at, maybe 10, 15 medical centers that you've been working with, or probably still are working with. So what are you doing there, and what is the outcome that you're looking to achieve and they're looking to achieve to have you come in and help them?
Well, over the past decade or so, there has been a true crisis in medicine. Burnout is rampant. Physicians have the highest suicide rate and addiction rate in the country.
Really?
Yes, for professional people. Yes. There's so much pressure on their shoulders, much of which is self-imposed. They're supposed to fix everybody. They're supposed to take care of everybody. They're supposed to save everybody from illness. It's a lot of pressure. And so I developed this curriculum that we teach through the American Medical Association to physicians and nurses to help them become self-reliant in the midst of all of these triggers that they have to deal with every day. And we see it in the news today with these docs and nurses having to deal with COVID and COVID patients. You can imagine it's overwhelming, the pressure that is on these people to help people in need. So I've been invited to many institutions to share the teaching about the mind and how to coordinate the functions of the mind to make conscious discriminating choices so that the world doesn't eat us up and we can actually thrive in the midst of challenging circumstances.
So what do you think is going on right now? I mean, as we look at what's going on in the nation politically, in different cities where you have sometimes riots running rampage, what's going on? What has happened to the society, to the individuals within the society? I don't ever remember in my lifetime this type of situation going on. And all of a sudden, it's just hit. And we don't have to get into the political of how that came about, but what's going on? Why do we see such anger, such frustration, such antagonism, and people literally doing things that you would never have anticipated would occur in this country in general?
I can only speak from my own personal perspective.
That's what I'm asking for.
So to me, it's very logical. The mind moves first and the body follows. This is one of the pillars of yoga science. The mind moves first and the body follows. What does that mean? It means I really cannot raise my hand without first entertaining a thought. So there's a mental action that takes place through thought before the hand can rise. And that's true both with speech and physical action. And of course, all actions that we take, all words that we speak, and even thoughts that we think bring about a consequence that can lead in one direction or another. Now, throughout history, there have been these times when the forces of animal consciousness, namely the mind-body-sense complex, because we are animals. We're clever, but we are animals.
We're clever animals, yeah.
We are clever animals, yeah. Throughout history, there has been a time where there's sort of a wrestling match, a hand wrestling match, an arm wrestling match between the forces of the animal versus the forces of the divine. You know, the stereotypical darkness versus light.
Mm-hmm.
We are in one of these situations right now, and it's all about the mind. So as we discuss the four functions of the mind, you'll be able to see and understand what's really happening in the world. Because most people that I have ever met on all sides of the political spectrum, these are good people. They are loving, they are caring people. But when they get locked down into habit patterns that are faulty, then they act unconsciously in service to things that bring about just what you're talking about, the anger, the fear, the contention, rather than the love that we are capable of giving in every situation.
Well, let's talk about what are those four functions of the mind, because I find that very fascinating how you've divided that out into the four different areas.
It is fascinating. And it's liberating. It's fascinating and it's liberating. So there are four functions of the mind. And you know, Doug, we all, as kids, we all we all had the intuition, gee, it seems like there are different voices in my mind telling me different things. And it turns out that that's true. There are four distinct voices. First is ego. Ego is hardwired to the reptilian brain, which means that the ego is all about self-preservation of the form. The ego does not want to die.
Okay.
And because of that, it likes to reprise pleasure, and it also is motivated to avoid pain. It likes things that are pleasant, and it likes to avoid things that are unpleasant. But you and I know from our own personal experience that that which is pleasant is not always good for us. And that which is unpleasant isn't always bad for us. So if I become habituated to only going after things that the mind likes and avoids everything that the mind does not like, I will have mental inflexibility, and that mental inflexibility will be equated sooner or later in physical inflexibility.
Oh, interesting. So that's the ego. Is the ego that part also that says, I'm right, I'm always right?
The ego has a limited perspective. This is critically important to remember. Ego has just a limited perspective, but as you suggest, Doug, it's often wrong, but it's never in doubt.
Okay. All right.
Never in doubt.
So that's the ego.
That's right.
Okay, by your definition. All right. So self-preservation, pleasant versus unpleasant, good versus bad. And I like what you brought up about the fact that oftentimes that which is pleasant isn't necessarily good for us as we look at consequences down the road, and that which is unpleasant isn't necessarily bad for us. And that's an insight that I think is important for all of us to have and understand.
I'll tell you, if and I tell people this regularly, that if I had the same mind I had when I was 14, and I don't know about you, but I assume this was the case with you too, but around 14 years of age, that was sort of, for me, was like the crown of creation. Around 14 years of age, I knew everything about everything.
Okay.
Okay. At least I thought I did.
You thought you did.
Okay. But I tell people that if I had the same mind I had when I was 14, and eating the same kinds of food that I was eating when I was 14, one of two things would be true. Either I would no longer be on the planet, or I would really be sick.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's ego. That's number one function.
Yes.
What's the next function?
Senses. Okay. The senses. The mind projects our creative energy through the eyes, the nostrils, the mouth, the ears, the hands, and the feet to go out into the material world, to look and smell and taste and hear and touch, and bring back information about what kinds of relationships are going to make us happy, what kind of relationships are going to make us secure, what kind of relationships are going to make us healthy. And
go ahead.
I'm thinking about a tube of toothpaste. We know it's fairly easy to squeeze the tube of toothpaste and out comes the toothpaste. But if we contemplate trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, it's virtually impossible, virtually impossible. And so when the mind projects our creative energy in search of happiness and security and health outside of ourselves, we can't bring back that creative energy. We can't use it again. And so what happens is the senses are like seventh grade children. And they're always looking for that which is pleasant, even though there's a backside to the front. But they like the front. And so they
Yeah.
go after those rainbows, but they never find what they're looking for.
Okay, so you talk about the senses. So I want to talk about that a little bit because you talk about verbal, or help me to get this right. So you've got the auditory, you've got your kinesthetic, which is touch, you've got your visual, which is the eyes. And what are the other senses? Those were three.
Smell,
Okay, so you've got the smell, so that's four. Auditory, visual,
visual,
smell,
smell, taste,
taste.
and
Okay.
touch.
And touch. Okay, great. So here's the question for you, because I find that, in fact, I've really been looking into this from a different perspective, because I'm finding that our children going to school really are struggling in many situations because they are not necessarily learning in the way that is being taught. So, for instance, I've got a son that is very much a visual learner. That's great. But what about those that are auditory or those that are kinesthetic? And those kids are being left out because they're not really able to understand, because that's not how they get information. Do you find that to be the case?
Sure, sure. Different people learn in different ways. What what this philosophy and this science is offering is experiential knowledge, learning through experience, not learning through memorization and recitation.
Right.
So in our schools, it's primarily memorization and recitation. And if we can memorize and recite, we'll get a degree. We'll
Yeah.
graduate. And theoretically, we'll get a better job than if we had no education in that regard. However, we're still in pain because nobody has taught us how to deal with emotions, which are so powerful. Mm-hmm.
And emotions, when you talk about how to deal with emotions, does that really fit into any of those five senses?
No, no, no.
Okay.
That's right.
So here we can be out.
Or in our education.
Yeah. So here we can be out observing something. And to me, that really gets interesting. I've got a couple of brothers that are attorneys, and I always love the story about how here's a car accident at an intersection, and you have five different witnesses, and every one of those witnesses tells a different story.
That's right.
And I would assume that part of that didn't mean to mean five and five senses, but part of that is because each one of them observe based on different ways. They may be visual, or they may be auditory, or whatever that happens to be.
Everybody's living in a separate universe.
Yeah. Yeah. And that becomes amazing to me, that's what's going on. But I think you bring up an interesting point. I've never thought about it before, is that the emotions have nothing to do with any of those five senses.
Right. Right.
So where do the emotions fit in?
Well, the emotions is all about sensual gratification. Always looking for pleasure. Always looking to avoid pain. We're looking to reprise pleasure through the senses. And
so when someone gets triggered about something, and all of a sudden you see their behavior, for instance, as we see what's going on right now in the country with a lot of these riots and so forth, there's something that's triggering that, and their emotion is bringing about a behavior in some cases that's not real pleasant and not really acceptable.
That's right. That's right. And so we have these emotions. We don't know how to handle them. We don't understand them, and they're so powerful. So we use the senses as a coping mechanism to take a little vacation. So maybe I'll have a drink. Maybe I'll have a big dinner. Maybe I'll go to Vegas. Maybe I'll buy a new pair of shoes. Mm-hmm. So the senses, it's very interesting. There is a story. I don't know if you like baseball or you're into baseball at all, but there were these three umpires, and they were having dinner together, and they were talking. They were talking shop. They're talking about what constitutes a ball and what constitutes a strike, because that's how they make a living. And so the first umpire is a rookie, and he says, "I call him as I see him." And the other two nod, yeah, yeah. And the second umpire, he's been calling balls and strikes for about 10 years. And what does he say? "I call them as they are." And the third umpire, he's an old pro. He's been calling balls and strikes for about 25 years in the bigs. And he looks at the other two and he says, "They are what I call them." So everybody is living in a separate universe.
Yeah.
And it depends on how well we understand and coordinate the functions of the mind. So we have the ego, we have the senses, both with limited perspectives, and part of that perspective, a lot of it is faulty. It's faulty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the third function of the mind is the unconscious. So this is the repository of everything that we deem essential to self-preservation. It's our memories, it's our imagination. What's going to keep us going, keep us alive, is the unconscious.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that, because that's in my sense, that's kind of where the emotions lie. But even with that, it's really where all of those imprints, those memories, as you say, the habits. Sometimes people, I think, refer to as subconscious versus unconscious. I think they're probably about the same.
They are the same.
But those are the things that the imprints, where we grow up as children and we've been imprinted by our parents, by our, our teachers, by our friends, by our religions.
That does beg the question, Doug, whose life are we living?
Exactly. I mean, I know every once in a while, as I've been, teaching a couple of things, I'll say, whose life are you living? Right. Whose life are you living? I'll do a personality profile, which I really enjoy, by the way. Yeah. And the ones that I like really go into the core personality, the social personality, and then the conscious. And the social personality, I always ask the question. I said, here in the social lies imprints. So here's the question. Are you living someone else's life because of all of those subconscious imprints, or have you become emotionally high enough quotient-wise to where you are in control? So if you're in a social situation, you don't care how you're supposed to act or everything, but you're consciously doing what you choose to do. That becomes really heavy when we talk about that subconscious, that unconscious mind, how that literally is controlling so many of our actions.
Oh, there's no question about it. The vast majority of the human beings are just skimming the level of consciousness, and it's really being dictated by unconscious forces. And we're being pulled like marionettes, but we don't have a clue.
No.
We don't have a clue.
No, in fact, it was interesting. I was having lunch with someone the other day, and we were talking a little bit about this, and I brought up the fact, and I was kind of joking about it. I said, I just went through this certification program, and here was a question that came up talking about emotions. So when someone gets triggered and they bring up this emotion, I said, you never want to do this with your spouse, but here's the question: what emotion did you bring up within yourself when this event occurred? Because events don't have emotions. And she goes, you would say that to your wife? And I'm going, no, we were told never to say it to, our spouse. But the reality is that events don't have emotions. And yet we look at an event, and I guess, as you say, we interpret that based on our five senses, and which is most powerful to us. And then we come up with an emotion that then affects our behavior.
That's right. That's right. And that's all based primarily in human beings on ignorance, because we don't know who we are. Yeah. Because the origin of all emotion comes from the four primitive fountains for food, sex, sleep, and self-preservation. Food, sex, sleep, and self-preservation. That's the origin of all emotion. And the essence of every single emotion is love. Because love is the most ancient traveler, traveling from eternity to eternity. But if I have a mind which is being hijacked exclusively by the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind, without input from the conscience, which has the exclusive power to discriminate, determine, judge, and decide, then that love force of emotion will be transformed into the. And if that desire for the object is thwarted and blocked, it burns to anger. And if that desire for the object happens to be fulfilled, it brings about fear that I might lose what I have. So fear, anger, and selfish desires are the consequence of our own ignorance of not knowing who we are.
Well, and I think, what's interesting is we look at the emotional tone scales, and there's a few out there that have been developed by different people. What's fascinating to me is you look at that, you see people who literally consciously or subconsciously, maybe more subconsciously, are living in one of those areas. They're living in fear. They're living in anger. And I have a couple of stories that I probably won't share with that, other than to say that when I've had some of my children come home and they've had a bad experience, and as we're talking about that, and it's someone who has said something to them in an unkind way, and I'll say, here's the bottom line. It's not about you. It's everything about them. They are living in an anger level. And because of that, they don't know how to communicate other than with anger. And it has nothing to do with you.
And why do they live in that paradigm? They live there in that paradigm because they identify with it. When somebody cuts us off in traffic, going at 90 miles an hour, and I have to slam on the brake to avoid an accident, and a rush of anger comes forward from my unconscious mind, I verbalize what? I am angry.
Yeah.
But that's impossible. That's an oxymoron. It's impossible for me to be anger. I am not an emotion. I am aware of an emotion. I have a relationship with an emotion, but I am not the emotion.
Okay.
But I had a relative, a close relative, and he had lower back pain, and I had lower back pain as a kid, because I stored all my fear in my lower back. And so I said to him, we have fairly comparable situations, neither of which is operable. And through this teaching, I've gone beyond the fear, and I don't have the back pain anymore. I could teach you a few things. And his response was, if I didn't have the pain in my back, how would I know who I was?
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Well, and you've mentioned the conscious. Let's get into the conscious mind here, because and that becomes a question. How does someone free themselves from all of this that's going on, where they're not experiencing a life of joy? They're not experiencing a life of happiness. They're not experiencing a life of love. And the reality is that they have to look into a mirror to discover why. So how do we do that? How do we let loose? We have fun. How does the conscious come into that literally allows us to change what we're experiencing and move forward into that life of joy and happiness?
Sure. So, we talked about the ego, the senses, and the unconscious mind. Those are the first three. The fourth function of the mind is the conscience. And the conscience is very interesting. As I mentioned, it's the only of the four functions of the mind that can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide. What that means is, surprisingly, shockingly, every single choice we have ever made, And every single choice we will ever make has always been and will always be made by the conscience. The conscience is the only function of the mind which can decide. Now, the conscience has the ability, if the ego senses and unconscious mind can quiet down for a few minutes and create a space between stimulus and response. The conscience has the capacity, because it operates functionally as a mirror that can reflect perfect wisdom from the super conscious portion of the mind. That's beyond the conscious, it's beyond the unconscious or subconscious, the superconscious portion of the mind, which is the same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein saw mathematical equations, where Paul McCartney hears beautiful melodies. Doesn't mean that you or I will become a songwriter or a physicist if we access this superconscious wisdom, but what it does mean is when the conscience can reflect that superconscious wisdom into our conscious mind, and we can employ it through speech and actions, it will definitely and positively affect every single unique relationship that we have.
All right. So I'm going to ask you a question that really comes to my mind as I've done this show for a number of years, and many of those who I have had an opportunity to interview have been through some type of relationship that has not been good for them, and they've experienced abuse and all of that, and so they've kind of been in that cohabitating type of situation where it's not good. How does one actually develop the ability to take that consciousness and be able to be at a level where, you know, I'm out there, you're out there driving, someone cuts in front of you and you're ready to just, you know, swear or whatever, and you go, okay, wait a minute, you know, maybe they're in a hurry to get to the hospital or whatever that happens to be. How does one go from being at the effect of those other three, the five senses, the ego, the unconscious, and actually gain control to the point where they are aware enough that when those things try to slip in, they're able to put a barrier up and say, nope, you're not going to get me this time? Because that's not easy for that awareness and that consciousness at that level that you're talking about to be achieved.
Right. So, you know, we need lessons in dancing. We need a new dance teacher. We have to dance with it differently. So if I'm driving down the road and at 50 miles, 60 miles an hour, and somebody 90 miles an hour cuts me off in traffic, and I have to slam on the brake, and I have an immediate reaction with anger. What is anger? What is fear? What is greed? Nothing but energy. It's just energy. Oh, and it's my energy. But when it comes to me in the form of anger and fear and greed stored from the unconscious mind, it's debilitating, it's contractive, it's poisonous. So what do we learn about energy? In 5th grade, energy can't be created, it can't be destroyed, but it can be transformed. Energy can be transformed. We know on a very practical level that we can transform ice into water and water into steam. So what's to stop us from transforming fear and anger and selfish desire into healing energy, an increase in willpower, and an expansion of our creativity? Nothing is stopping us. So when I'm cut off and I have a relationship with anger and I'm being triggered by it, I try to create a space between stimulus and response. I try to slow things down. That space between stimulus and response gives me one important thing: freedom to deal with this powerful energy that's has the potential to harm me but also has the potential to save me and make my life better. And the mechanism for transforming it is sacrifice. Sacrifice it back to the origin from which it came. Now, we have a problem with sacrifice because our culture defines sacrifice as denial, but it's not. It's all about, it comes from the Latin, the word sacrifice. Sacrifici goes in through the Italian. Sacrifici, make it sacred. It is sacred, but the form in which it's coming to me is asking me to dance with it differently. Instead of serving it in mind, action, and speech, and causing pain to me and others, if I honor it and witness it and sacrifice it back to the one origin from which everything has come, no thank you, I have no use for this energy in this form. Please take it and transform it. It will automatically be transformed into strategic reserves of healing energy, willpower, and creativity that will be deposited in my personal bank account in the subtle world. And I can draw on that energy, willpower, and creativity when I have another relationship that requires those requisites for a rewarding outcome.
So how do we do it?
Practice, experiment.
How do I go about getting to the point where I understand that and consciously, and I like what you talked about, consciously going between the, the response versus the action and the response, putting a space there to give it a little bit of time to think. So what you're saying is we've got to be able to consciously be able to see what's going on, observe that, and recognize that we have the ability to choose.
Sure, right.
How we're going to respond.
Right, yeah. So I'll tell you what I do. I make an appointment with my mind. And I sit the entire array of the four functions of the mind, including myself, down around the kitchen table. And I'm sort of the moderator because I'm the parent. Ego. We just finished dinner. The question before all of us is, are we going to brush our teeth? What do you say, ego? And everybody's going to listen to you. It's not pleasant. No, I'm against it. Okay, thank you very much. Senses? To be very honest, I don't want to brush my teeth right now because I want a second piece of apple pie. Unconscious mind? What do you say? I'm with the other two. Okay, thank you each for sharing, your limited perspective. Now, let's sit quietly and we'll listen to the conscience. Conscience, what is the superconscious wisdom that you are accessing, and what value is it to us? Well, says the conscience, this life that we're living as human beings is not a sprint. We have to recognize that it's a marathon. In a marathon, we need healthy teeth. We need healthy gums. We need a healthy and strong immune system. And brushing our teeth is going to help. So my recommendation is brush the teeth. And it's up to me to convince the ego, senses, and unconscious mind with this seemingly insignificant no-brainer of an experiment to come together to the bathroom to brush our teeth and then come back to the kitchen table to discuss what we experienced. And that's what happened.
And have your second helping of pie. So in the short time that we have left, how does the science of yoga fit into all of this?
This is it. This is it. Yoga. And when the ego, senses, and unconscious mind come back to the kitchen table, the ego says, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. The senses say, when the tongue glides over the teeth, I don't feel that mossy feeling. I always didn't like that mossy feeling. So it's not too bad, this brushing of the teeth routine. And same with the unconscious mind. So I've made a friend with the ego, senses, and unconscious mind, and they trust me. That change does not mean their death.
So, how does meditation fit into all of this? Because I know that's a big thing. And for some of us, meditation is really not easy. But how does meditation fit into this? And how do people learn to meditate in a positive way?
Meditation is not easy for us because we're human beings and we have not trained the mind to be one pointed. In fact, our culture is constantly selling multitasking, which we all know is impossible. But in order for the mind to go back and forth between two objects or three objects in a very short period of time, the only way that the mind can do that is with a tremendous amount of adrenaline, which depresses the immune system and depresses the mind. Mm-hmm. So the conscience is the key to everything that we're looking for. It's just, it has this capacity to reflect superconscious wisdom. So we just need to do the experiments. We just need to do the experiments.
All right. Well, and here your book. Tell us a little bit about your book, Your Conscious.
Yeah, the conscience, your conscience, is about just what we've been discussing, is about understanding and coordinating the ego, senses, and unconscious mind to eliminate the anarchy in the mind and have union in the mind, union between the ego, senses, unconscious mind, and the conscience, so that we are one holistic organism pulling together toward happiness, toward security, toward health.
Is it fair to sit back and go, okay, I'm going to analyze here. I'm going to look at what I'm experiencing in life. Either I'm not experiencing what I want to, I'm not experiencing that joy, that love, that happiness, that health, whatever that happens to be. Is that the way in which we can actually sit back for a minute and go, okay, let the conscious come in here and go, I'm not happy with the outcome of what's going on right now. Therefore, I need to go back in and identify those other three levels of the ego, the five senses, the unconscious, what is causing that behavior, and ultimately change it.
Yes, our job is to be the parent to encourage the ego, senses, and unconscious mind to imagine themselves as something greater than they are, to expand the perspective of the ego, to expand the perspective of the senses, to expand the perspective of the unconscious mind. Right now, it's a very myopic perspective.
Right. So if you could share just one or two thoughts with the audience as we close up this interview, what would you say to them? What would be your counsel to them?
My counsel to them is, do not believe anything that you heard Leonard say today. Don't believe him. Be a doubting Thomas. But if what you have heard today is of interest to you on any level, then experiment with it. Experiment with it within the constellation of your own relationships and see what truth is revealed to you by basing your outer actions, thoughts, words, and deeds on your own inner wisdom, your own superconscious wisdom reflected by your conscience, and just see what happens.
Beautiful.
My experience is I have felt better. That's why I am doing this with my life. That's why during quarantine with COVID, I wrote this book so that other people can be empowered to go beyond the pain, the misery, and the bondage of human life.
Okay, and how do people find this book? Again, folks, Your Conscious, the key to unlock limitless wisdom and creativity and solve all of life's challenges. Where do they find the book?
Okay, the website for the book is yourconscience.org. yourconscience.org.
All right. Leonard, this has been fascinating. And you know what? We could go on for hours about this. I mean, I have a list of questions that I got and maybe through one, 3 or 4 of them. So we could go forever, but this is really fascinating. I think you hit on something really, really important. And hopefully, folks, as you listen to this, grab that book. If you find yourself not really in control of what's going on in your life, now's the time to get a hold of this book and really look at it. So thanks for listening. Leonard, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And folks, hope you join us again soon. And meanwhile, have a very conscious and wonderful week.